Well, what I want to talk about, which is chapter 1, introduction, is the intellectual abandonment of Africa. An observant person will note that African languages receive little formal attention. That is in today's world. For example, Google Translate, that worked for 64 languages as late as 2017. Now, I've changed it now, but in 2017, only one African language was included. That was Swahili. 2, if you include Afrikaans as an African language. United Nations website offers translation of its content into 6 languages. Now, the World Health Organization does a bit better and offers translation to 7 languages, but none of those languages are African languages. This despite there being almost 1.4 billion people in Africa, almost throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Official languages in use are European or Arabic. Somalia perhaps the only exception. Now, Swahili is widely used in Tanzania, but it's not used in higher education. So broad domination of English is widely evident wherever you look. Ethiopia, makes use of Amharic, but again, higher education is carried out using European languages, particularly English. Linguists tell us that languages reflect, express, and carry a people's culture. The implication of the widespread neglect of African languages is that African cultures and African thinking, unfortunately also, are not being taken seriously. The reasons for African languages or lingua cultures not being taken seriously include some of the following. 1, of course, Western languages like English, French, Portuguese, they've become just high prestige languages throughout the continent. Use of these European languages is these days associated with what? Power and wealth. 2, many African ways of life are economically not very productive. This results in what? They're basically being dominated by outsiders, and outsiders' languages in addition. 3, early policies of many Western peoples who colonized Africa were based on the assumption, this is rooted in biological racism at the time, that black African people are genetically inferior. As a result, it was anticipated that they would be ruled by foreigners in perpetuity. Hence, governing education and other systems were set up using outside languages. Without local people in mind, however, this is problematic. Foundational orientations initiated in the colonial era are now proving very hard to reverse. Many scholars and powerful global players seem not to be over-concerned regarding the decline through limited use of indigenous languages. This is happening throughout Africa, in practice because the economic and even social thriving of indigenous people hinges on acceptance of the dominance of outside languages. The result is that many African people are relatively powerless in the face of this foreign language hegemony. Many laymen and even scholars in the West seem to be largely naively unaware of ways in which the language impacts ways of life. So instead of making this case here, I refer my reader to other work, much of that I've done, that elaborates on this relationship between language and ways of life. Many of these are posted on my academia.edu page. In brief, African people being taught to use languages that do not connect to their own ways of life results in their being obliged to claim to understand concepts that have actually no familiar foundations for them and in their ways of life. Alternatively, they may have to concede ignorance or refuse to rote learn what they do not understand. But if they refuse to rote learn that which they don't understand, their voices cease to be taken seriously in the global arena. European languages that have been both intentionally and subconsciously forged by native speakers of those languages are not perfect. Over centuries they've been Christianized. Reformations have happened, enlightenment has happened, modernization has happened. So in their popular use, they just don't enable expression of many cultural facets that underlie African ways of life. The latter have, according to Santos, been rendered non-existent, is the term he uses, to Western eyes. Use of European languages that remain under outside control for formal purposes in Africa, that is. Informal, yes, indigenous languages, but those formal purposes handicap African people's efforts at communicating clearly with one another, as well as with outsiders. Why? Because these linguistic features of communication are little understood. Uninitiated Western people who are unaware of them can, by missing the linguistic origins of their deficiencies, conclude that their African colleagues, well, what about them? They're unintelligent. And it's really a linguistic issue. So use of European languages is particularly poorly suited for intercultural, that is, e.g. West to Africa communication. What African people have to say frequently seems to be of little interest to European people, who anyway consider their own comprehension of life to be just better than that of Africans. The implications of the intellectual abandonment of Africa, that is a focus of this discussion, I suggest, are many. They're wide. The implications are deep. The implications are not widely even recognized in many circles. The reasons they are not widely recognized, well, they include things like this. One, there's a very widespread and implicit belief in the contemporary world that people are what? They're blank slates. That is to say, the blank slate theory, it says that people are born with little or no basis for their particular thinking. That thinking is a people. Instead, this theory assumes that all their intellectual capabilities arise subsequently, basically that they're acquired from the impact on them of their environment. This is in line with John Locke's belief, that is, that all knowledge comes from sense experience. In practice, this is widely interpreted as implying that formal education forms a person. As a result, people from widely diverse cultural origins tend to be considered to be intellectually equivalent. So, if not actually the same. This is an outcome then assumed of going through the same educational process in the same language. Following this theory, educating African people should, of course, remove all cultural and behavioral gaps. Then the gaps will be closed and they will be just the same as European people. Number two, blank slate thinking is combined with a materialistic understanding. This materialistic understanding considers a category of religion to be an unnecessary vestige of a prior age. Many scholars have claimed that cognitive science has debunked religion. The propounding of theories that debunk a valid debunk a historical role for religion underwrites contemporary dominant ideologies such as those of modernization and secularization. These notions that were popularized largely after World War II continue to underlie a vast amount of the activities of major global players today. Even the very widely recognized revival of religion, as it's called, this has been global since the 1970s, but it's not undone these formal foundations to an intellectually based decision making. Those processes continue. Undoing the wrong thinking that guided post-World War institutions would, for many, frankly, be far too disruptive of the global status quo. Unfortunately, the intellectual abandonment of Africa that I'm here talking about is required to support this wrong thinking. Now, some may ask, if what I claim above is true, why are African people themselves not endeavouring to point it out? Some, of course, are. Dr. Vodi Balcom, a black from America, is a prominent example of this I recently came across. He is trying to point out some of these issues, but of course what happens is the dominant intellectual system pretty much ignores such people on the assumption that because they're religious, well, they're not to be taken seriously. Many who endeavour to point out what is happening are frankly not able to acquire adequate levels of English to be heard, or are simply marginalised by the mainstream. You could say they're cancelled, I guess. Today's dominant secular system, being what it is, pays the wages and brings formal prestige. Kicking against the goad is more than many feel that they can afford to do. Honesty easily results in economic decline and the formal social irrelevance of one's message. Now, the time I first came to Africa, that was in 1988, I essentially, although I didn't really realise it, believed in modernisation theory, secularisation theory, and I believed that my African colleagues were blank slates. When I endeavoured to engage with them on that basis, however, now I hit problems. My projects didn't work. My African colleagues did not have the cultural background that they needed to understand or be able to really appropriate what it was that I was saying. My own comprehension was foundationally foreign to them. Thus it was my long-term, 1988 to date, committed, immersed experience with exposure to African people and contexts. That's what has resulted now in my current comprehension of what is going on. On this basis, I would like to declare two things about why the research methodology, even methodologies respected by contemporary Western academia, cannot reveal what is going on in Africa today. One, African people are not blank slates. Actually, what are they? They're part of a culture. They're part of a way of life that was already there before the colonialists, of course, came on the scene. Now, of course, cultures are dynamic. To say that cultures are dynamic and change, they change with time, though it's different from saying that they can simply be supplanted. Contemporary thinking seems to think they need to be supplanted within a generation or two. Amongst the many reasons why what African people are is carefully concealed is, of course, fear of accusations of racism. That is on the part of those who would reveal the truth. Two, secularization and modernization theories are fundamentally flawed. That is to say that they're insufficient. They do not suffice to explain all that goes on when majority world people and cultures meet the West. There's much more going on than modernization theory supposes. While these theories may point to some things that actually do go on, reductionist secular scholars who expect the theories to be predictive fail to take account of an enormous amount that's actually going on. Without going into great depth on this, I take Ben Jones, as an example of a secular Western scholar based in University of East Anglia who expected secular NGOs to be something that mattered. He expected them to have effects in Africa But actually, he tells us he found little to show for their work. Jones goes on to explain that churches integrated into African communities become indigenous forums for discussion of all kinds that engages actively with local ways of life. So really a contrast between the secular and the Christian. This integration of the churches in local ways of life is ignored by secularism that assumes a human duality between the physical and the spiritual. In recent decades, the spiritual that is considered to be connected to religion, what's happened to it? Well, it's taken as superfluous and kind of considered supernatural, for example, not part of human natural living. I suggest there's nothing inherently supernatural to the spiritual, as if nature can run independently of it, but that the supernatural and natural are simply part of the same reality. This is how reality is viewed in Africa. But secular historians are inclined either to ignore or to use their own means to explain radical changes brought by who? Well, actually by charismatic and religious people in the past. Secular historians explain their own way. When they articulate such, they point, for example, to how changes in behavior can be adequately explained without reference to the spiritual world. They can just be explained by people's orientation to their material self-interest. Thus is a secular claim, with which I very much disagree. Indeed, it's been my observation time and time again that people are motivated to act by a hope that goes way beyond this world's evident parameters. People hope in more than the physical. As George Steiner says, language is the main instrument of man's refusal to accept the world as it is. Language is not describing the world, it's refusing the world. People are oriented to eternity according to Ecclesiastes 3:11, not just to things of this world. Pretending to do away with people's orientation to eternity, actually what does it do? It discourages innovation, progress and human contentment. It results in a kind of a stalemate, even depression, running theories into the ground. I would also point to the ontological turn. Many proponents of the ontological turn beg to differ with the view that there are many worldviews and only one world. The ontological turn that's come into vogue recently instead proposes that worlds as well as worldviews may vary. The African world is simply different from the West's world in that respect. So rather than taking a Western approach to trying to prove God's existence, I believe the most helpful starting point in the exploration of the divine is to acknowledge with Berkeley that actually God's actions are implicit and are necessary in all human experience. That is experience of others, experience of the world around them, and so on. In other words, God is. God said to Moses, I am who I am, Exodus 3:14. To pretend otherwise, on the basis of what happens to be, contemporary fad really of science, in some ways, is to deceive. The existence of contexts inside and outside of African people's own minds that have been different from those of many of today's contemporary Western people has contributed to distinctly different orientations to life. Such different orientations are consequential. They're consequential in many areas of human existence and functioning. They're deeply rooted. Discovering what the differences are so that they can be compensated for and allowed for in all kinds of ways, like in the design of policies that will assist global thriving today, what does this require? It requires them to be comprehended. They need to be given due allowance. Current conditions, though, of the widespread use of European languages really doesn't do that. Instead, we have economic domination from the outside. The West makes achievement of such comprehension extremely difficult. Reasons for difficulty in comprehension of African thinking and behaviour have been mentioned above. Things like the fact that honesty on the part of African people, what does it do? It pushes them into obscurity. If they're honest, they're no longer taken seriously. They end up in poverty. Clear and definite reorientations are required to perceive and begin to take account of basic cultural differences. The means familiar to me for doing this purpose is known as Vulnerable Mission. To find out more about this, see vulnerablemission.org. Following Vulnerable Mission principles, some Westerners are enabled, including some Western scholars, to interact with African people while in African home cultures. So Vulnerable Mission attempts to give them that ability, using indigenous languages and also relying on indigenous resources, so not buying power through foreign resources. They seek to understand African people in these ways. If that isn't happening, there's a danger that misconception will continue, and as a result, contemporary African people will continue to live in ways that are intellectually disconnected from the realities in which they are immersed. Note that although most of my research comes from Western Kenya, now I do prefer to use the term Africans rather than refer to a particular tribe or Kenyans and so on. This is to avoid the impression that I consider one particular tribe or region in Africa to be peculiar, singularly different from other people in other parts of the world. I believe apparent differences often arise from diverse ways in which history has been recorded. Languages have been translated and research has been done. Note also my focus on Vulnerable Mission. I consider Vulnerable Mission to be the best means available of outreach by the West, whether it be for purpose of research, development, Christian mission. All of them could benefit from Vulnerable Mission. All these should try by at least some people in those fields should try carrying out indigenous languages without subsidizing what they are doing. Using non-indigenous resources, unfortunately, will also buy them power which will stop them from listening. These principles need to be determinedly adhered to, despite coming under pressure to use English to help in situations that seem to be dire. I'm talking here about practice. A discussion in this book relates to an urbanizing Africa. As cities are growing and that they act as magnets, drawing, especially of course young people, is well known. They go to the cities. That's widely appreciated. Urbanization is also considered more broadly. Many features of life at one time confined to urban centers, knowledge of European languages, for example, global interactions, even on a daily basis, including the ability to make a living by performing a task in close connection with distant metropolis. People in a distant metropolis are increasingly facilitated by the availability of the internet. They're facilitated even in very rural contexts. This book concerns the impact arising from growing urban intrusions into the life of almost everyone in Africa today. The contents of the chapters of this book can be summarized as follows. Chapter 1. This is the introduction, which you're hearing now, points to ways in which African people's innate avenues of thinking are increasingly these days considered taboo, so are ignored. They're allowed to fester rather than to develop, grow, and blossom. Chapter 2, I was struck by the contents of a sermon in 2010 I happened to hear at a church in Kenya. It was presented in the Luo language. It was translated into the Swahili language. The categories being employed by the speaker were, in terms of Western languages, especially English, incongruous, I suggest. This is despite their apparently tallying with 4 very ordinary English words: money, hope, fear, and love. Correct comprehension of what was being said actually required me to draw not on my knowledge of English, but what I had learned or managed to gather impressionistically through long subjective exposure sharing life with Luo people over an extended period. I cannot easily quantify or even outline these insights. They had no objective origins. I realized that indigenous people also would very likely not agree with my impressions, for various reasons. My being a native English speaker, exploring Africa, yet my colleagues being, of course, African people, who native African language speakers adopting English. It's quite different. This makes a lot of difference. Chapter 3, this is a short chapter. In this chapter, imagine Africans as dairy farmers and Westerners as sheep farmers. So, contrasting 2 different husbandry practices, I find clarifies differences that may be less clear-cut between cultures of, human cultures. Thus, the folly of the use of one language across cultural difference, i.e., use of Western languages in Africa, is exposed. Chapter 4. The notion that literacy might be of other than religious or esoteric value, being a product of, this is a product of Western Protestantism, raises questions regarding its contemporary spread, so the contemporary spread of literacy, and the extent to which literacy may still be considered inherently religious or esoteric in some parts of the world. This chapter proposes profound implications arising from consideration of this, arguably contextual difference between Western and non-Western Englishes. Chapter 5. Many scholars producing academic writing on Africa quickly learn to beware. They have to beware of the sin of generalizing. This is essentially to assume that diverse African peoples have things in common. Generalizing is assuming African people have things in common that are not found in the West. Such prohibition of so-called generalization is used to maintain an apparent universal direct relevance of Western scholarship in Africa. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 contains a full articulation of a greater number of arguments that seek to qualify today's prohibition of generalization. It thus renders both African communication, communality, so African communality, cultural facets of people's lives that are similar across Africa, and the work of the gospel visible. In chapter 7, I look at a general invisibility of translation. This has in recent decades popularized the incorrect assumption that profound bodies of interconnected knowledge that affect the whole of life can simply be transferred wholesale. That those bodies of knowledge can simply be moved from one language to another. Actually, information is always domestic. It's always domesticated into its target language and culture, a process that requires a very profound knowledge of that target translation. So we need translation from unknown to known. Translation from unknown to known must always be prioritized over that from known to unknown. The impact of this vitally important principle, being these days largely ignored, is potentially catastrophic. Chapter 8. Human satisfaction is often supplemented by suffering, failure, or even death of others. This is met metonymically represented by the shedding of blood. The rejection by modern thinking of traditional logic that sees shedding of blood as healing has transformed African solutions to coronavirus into fake news, I suggest. This chapter explores implications of this kind of transformation. In Chapter 9, conventional Western and modern ways of considering and evaluating Africa are found to be faulty. The chapter points to the nature of such faultiness. For example, the expectation that use of English can be adequate and helpful for delineating indigenous African categories. The chapter draws on the work of the late French scholar René Girard as a basis for a proposal regarding how to make sense of what is unconventional. Chapter 10. Drawing heavily on insights from the same René Girard, aggression in African worship is here under the spotlight. Sometimes African people shout and scream and make a lot of noise in aggressive dancing and so on. Why is this? Well, surely it's connected to a desire for cleansing by imitating even the lynching of a witch. When correctly focused as a reenactment of Christ's death on the cross, this kind of activity we don't need to be bewildered by it. It should be understood as being a means of bringing healing and cleansing. Chapter 11 explores theology as an alternative to rainmaking, as foundation, that is, for leadership in Africa. Some peculiarities of African styles of worship appear to arise from rainmaking traditions. So if you explore the rainmaking, you discover what pastors are doing. Adherence to the Bible gives a marked improvement. Chapter 12. Why Bible translations are these days prolifically being produced. Production of associated study texts in indigenous languages is often lacking. This has proven stubbornly difficult. This chapter articulates the difficulty and the difficulties and how to overcome such difficulties with reference to study Bible production. Chapter 13 suggests that largely unrecognized sleight of hand has contributed to, if not formed, today's logic in the West. This is a logic that has many accepting that bogus strawman category of religion. Once defined and accepted, religion can be considered really no more than a primitive relic. So it's condemned by modern thinkers. Associated historionaivety is denying people a knowledge of Christ. Chapter 14. Chapter 14 contains an impassioned plea for the reader of this chapter to cease being hoodwinked and misled by contemporary secular society. That is when it is evident that all that humans do is actually religious. That includes even the roots of secularism itself are found in religion. In chapter 15, that African people might believe that God can protect them from the coronavirus might seem incredible in the West, but very normal in parts of the continent. This coronavirus case study, written in 2020, considers numerous really important ways in which policymakers must take African people's religion, their belief in God seriously. Chapter 16. Was pre-colonial Africa peaceful, healthy and prosperous? Today's problems in Africa are often blamed on what? Colonialism, modernity, and even Christianity. So pre-colonial Africa is as if it was free, but it wasn't free from fujo. Fujo is a Swahili term, like destructive mayhem. So this chapter draws heavily on the work of the late Tanzanian novelist Euphrates Kizilahari, interpreted through a lens of long-term close living and exposure to East African people. Chapter 17, compulsory church attendance. It might be amazing for people to realize it was once widespread in Europe. This historical requirement makes up part of the history of contemporary West. Contemporarily deploring and mocking that notion that perhaps religion should be enforced at government level may not be very appropriate actually in today's West. Okay, it may not be appropriate to make religion like that, but as in the past government enforced religion, maybe it'll still be helpful in parts of the non-West. Disparaging of government involvement can be considered evil if it results in a wanton depreciation of something, a belief that really carries many important benefits to human society. Other things are made mandatory, like education. Chapter 18, the West is adamant that racism is wrong. It rarely considers, however, the foundations on which its opposition to racism is built. One such foundation I here critique is secularism. That is, the assumption of normality. Racism has an underlying assumption of normality, and that is secular. The power of the West is such as to spread this assumption of normality globally. So, African people, even in Africa, must be treated as if they're secular, whether they are or not. This actually conceals the religiosity of African people in the interests of not being racist. Chapter 19, digging a little into the nature of some indigenous African categories of thought related to the English concept of emotion, reveals ways of identifying what Africans mean by poverty. Comprehensions of African terms frequently used to translate English terms like, that of poverty, may seem, from a secular vantage point, to be out of this world. Amongst other things, exploration of implicit indigenous African categories of thought and understanding reveal English comprehensions of African ways of life and the concomitant prescriptions for action coming from the English-speaking world to be compromised by their own illogicality. Chapter 20 looks at vulnerable approaches to majority world people as defined in this text permit an otherwise largely unmatched deep level of cultural comprehension. So this chapter considers the implications of such an approaches, revealing that world religions considered, many think they're kind of objective. Of course there are world religions all over. They're actually reifications, I here suggest, of the meeting of non-Western ways of life and Christianity. The implications of this nature of world religions are explored in this chapter. Chapter 21. How one uses language is key to on-the-ground ministry. You might ask questions, but if there are no answers available, admissible, then asking the question reveals the ignorance of the person asking. Language can reflect truth, or it can build truth. The availability of funding can create its own truths. Telling the truth about Africans can be interpreted as theft if the truth would result in a potential donor not supporting a project. Telling the truth to Africans about how people live in the West can generate envy. Some truths are plainly untranslatable. Chapter 22, well-connected Western missionaries carrying out ministry, drawing on access they have to outside resources, and their mastery of the globalized language of English has implications. they build on what is not locally available. All too often this unhelpfully forces them to minister through saying something like this: do what I say, not do what I do. Chapter 23. Now, guilt may not be very pleasant, but this chapter points to ways in which it is actually much more desirable than are either fear or shame. Chapter explains this in relation to evident characteristics of many contemporary African communities. How Christianity is appreciated for moving people from fear of ancestral revenge and from fear of shame to guilt, for which they can be forgiven. Chapter 24. May not be helpful for talking to jump ahead of action. Verbally declaring something to be the case, therefore, before it actually is the case, may deter those who are preoccupied into making it the case from their endeavour. So, use of Western languages that, in other words, presuppose, say, open altruism, can delay adoption of the same open altruism by African people. Finally, chapter 25 is a study of the amazing love of God in intercultural context.